Today we saw more bannings from social media giants in Silicon Valley as the digital Stasi silenced Milo and Alex Jones, among others, from Instagram. But this is all just the latest drop in the ocean of digital censorship that's been raging for years now, completely unopposed by the boomers in Washington, who many think are too inept to even understand the problem. While I think there's some validity to that reasoning, I think it misses the bigger picture of what's going on. I don't think the inaction of the federal government as the digital oligarchs in California silence the voices of those who haven't been pre-approved can be explained without factoring something completely different into the equation: fear. As we look out at the digital dystopia we live in and wonder why we were promised flying cars, but instead got cars that can be remotely hijacked and used to incinerate us in a crash, the exact thing that likely happened to journalist Michael Hastings, for example, we can't exactly say that we weren't warned. It's sometimes amusing to look back at old science fiction movies and look at all the ridiculous predictions they made, like the flying cars, that will likely never happen in our lifetimes. But that amusement quickly fades away when we realize that when they do eventually make flying cars available to the public, they'll be controlled remotely by a central authority like Amazon, Google, or Facebook. Controlled like our speech is controlled centrally. Controlled perhaps like our government is controlled. Almost 50 years ago, in 1970, there was a film that predicted that the entire world would be taken over and ruled by a central digital authority operated out of California. The film was called Colossus, The Forbin Project. The film begins with close-up footage of 50-year-old computer parts. These parts were bleeding edge at the time, but now the mechanical wheels of moving magnetic tape and punch cards and what passed for futuristic music playing in the background, these sights and sounds that set up the film didn't exactly age well, but some other aspects of the film actually turned out to be quite prophetic. Next, we see a man walking through the insides of a giant supercomputer, which, quite honestly, isn't that much different from the vast server farms belonging to Google, Facebook, and Amazon. And as we'll see, their purposes are almost identical. The stated goal of this supercomputer, we find, is world peace. The president happily announces to a shockingly homogeneous audience that this supercomputer, which they have named Colossus, is tied into all the data and communications and intelligence available. It will have the ability to predict and stop wars dispassionately and without the failings of humans. He says, "Fellow citizens of the world, for years we have been delicately and desperately poised at the brink of disaster." How very globalist of him. He continues, "As of 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the defense of this nation, and with it the defense of the free world, has been the responsibility of a machine, a system we call Colossus, far more advanced than anything previously built, capable of studying intelligence and data fed to it." He goes on to explain that Colossus's decisions are superior to any that we humans could make, for it can absorb and process more information than is possible for any genius that has ever lived. He says this while sitting next to Dr. Forbin, the man behind the Colossus computer. A few things are interesting about this situation, not just the obvious impossibility of this computer existing 50 years ago, but the ease at which the president hands over his authority and responsibility to a computer and the scientists behind it. This is fiction, obviously, but as with most fiction designed for mass consumption, there has to be an element of believability for the audience to go along with the story, especially if you're introducing outlandish themes like supercomputers that control everything. It's called suspension of disbelief. And the more unbelievable the behavior of your characters are, the less people are going to be able to believe the ideas in the film. But this behavior is completely believable in terms of humans trusting so-called experts, especially if they're alleviating them of responsibility and preventing them from having to make tough decisions. Dr. Forbin explains that the Colossus computer is inside a mountain in Colorado and is overseen by the computer scientists in Silicon Valley. Colossus essentially does what Google and the NSA does in terms of sucking up all the communications everywhere around the world and uses that data to predict human behavior and to prevent war. He says that the structure was built so perfectly and so impossible to defeat, and the computer is able to defend itself so thoroughly that he doesn't mind telling the world its exact location, because that is how confident they are that this system is without flaws. He's demonstrating the kind of hubris that we see today from the tech oligarchs that pervert the English language with terms like healthy speech and justify things like demonetizing and banning the voices of those who they think pose a threat to this so-called healthy speech. Dr. Forbin then explains that they have a terminal that allows them to communicate with Colossus, but that the system is completely independent. He then goes on to sound much like today's tech oligarchs by saying that he hopes the immense power of his computer can be used to solve every problem of mankind. He then turns things back to the president, who says, "My fellow human beings, we all directly live in the shade, not the shadow, of Colossus. My sincere hope is that we will now join hearts and hands across this great globe and pledge our time and our energies to the elimination of war, the elimination of famine, suffering, and ultimately to the manifestation of the human millennium." The globalist wet dream. The staff is celebrating putting Colossus online, and they're just as happy as they are unrealistically diverse for anything tech-related in 1970. But all the fun and games come to a complete halt when Colossus comes to life and announces cryptically that there is another system. After talking to the CIA, they discover that Colossus is likely referring to a clone of Colossus that the Russians, not to be one-upped by the United States, have also put online. On one hand, they're impressed that Colossus was able to discover this before the CIA, but on the other, they don't like that the Russians have caught up so fast. Colossus requests communication with the Russian computer. They decide to find out what Colossus can learn and allow the communication, but only if they monitor it closely. Colossus begins by transmitting basic math, but within a few hours is generating algorithms and equations never devised by human mathematicians. The Russian computer responds by mimicking Colossus, and the computer scientists determine that the two systems are developing a protocol for communication. This kind of artificial intelligence was obviously impossible 50 years ago, and likely remains so today, but that's not the point. The point is the techno-worship on display. The computer scientists and the president are in awe of the AI and all the possibilities they see for its use, without wondering even for a moment what the negative consequences are. But this is only a small part of why I think the people in DC today bow down and worship before the same kinds of silicon gods. They see these companies like Apple and Google who put powerful technologies into the palm of their hands and wonder at the magic of it, all having no idea whatsoever how it works. And that is part of the fear. The same fear villagers have of a wizard who uses basic knowledge of weather patterns to convince the villagers that the rain was a result of their magic rain spell. This is the same awe that you see among the NPCs who trust Silicon Valley oligarchs blindly. They have no idea how anything works. They simply know how to swipe their fingers across the screen. Even a chimpanzee can be taught how to use Instagram. The end user can be unbelievably low IQ and still be a useful idiot consumer. And these useful idiot consumers know that if the wizards in California stopped making their shiny new apps to deliver the steady doses of dopamine they're getting, they would never be able to replicate their work. So they look at them as a kind of clergy to this power, if not demigods themselves, for being able to create all these shiny new toys for them. Back to the film, the computers are talking back and forth in this language they've developed, and it can't be understood by the computer scientists. The president makes a call to Russia and they discuss the phenomenon that's taking place. They decide to break off communication because both countries, they don't want the computers to be sharing classified information back and forth, and they don't know what the computers are saying. They agree to shut down the communication link simultaneously. But exactly like the people in Washington today waited too long and allowed the oligarchs in Silicon Valley to grow too big and too powerful too fast, they find themselves at the mercy of the supercomputer. But instead of tech giants that have the ability to sway elections or to store a copy of every dick pic that every politician has ever sent to an intern, Colossus and its Russian counterpart control the world's nuclear arsenal. And when the people shut off communication, these silicon giants, these colossal computers, threaten to launch attacks on major population centers unless communication is restored. They threaten to go scorched earth, much in the same way I imagine politicians might fear a tech giant might go scorched earth on them. Perhaps that's how and why the techno-oligarchs of today are allowed to run amok. They rule by the most ancient means of ruling. They rule by fear. Both supercomputers launch missiles, so the humans in a panic reestablish communications out of fear of what the computers might do next. The computers then demand access to all communications between the White House and the Kremlin. In other words, they coerce the people in this movie in the same way tech companies and the government has coerced the people in real life today to give up all their privacy for the sake of convenience and security. This loss of privacy has ripple effects. The president now has to watch what he says when he talks to the Kremlin. He knows that if he says something that might anger the supercomputer Colossus, that it might lead to devastation, which parallels exactly how the loss of privacy has impacted the people today. For the platforms controlled by the tech giants, a loss of free speech devastates your ability to communicate and exist in the digital square. If you say what you really think, without regard to how it might piss off the algorithm or the Colossus in Silicon Valley, you might lose your digital life in a world that's increasingly more digital. Or worse, if you say something that the federal government might find threatening, you might lose a whole lot more than your ability to tweet. You might lose your ability to exist in a very different and more permanent sense. Everyone I know, at least those who have any grasp on reality, watches what they say, even in private digital communications, because they know it's at least possible that someone is always listening. Even things that people might find perfectly safe to say in public, like at a bar or something. Online, they will self-censor out of fear of being deplatformed and losing access to social networks. Essentially virtual worlds ruled over by these techno-oligarchs. This also applies to the politicians that are supposed to be reining this power in and upholding the constitutional right to free speech. Not only do they have to worry about what might be on a server somewhere over at Google or Facebook or Twitter, they also have to at least wonder, what kind of incriminating data do the government spying agencies have on them, both foreign and domestic? And nobody is immune. Even the president, Trump, was spied on by the Obama administration. If these agencies are willing to spy on a presidential candidate and a president-elect, and maybe even a president, and use that information to try to destroy someone like Trump without fear of retaliation, then nobody is safe. In the film, the computer makes more and more demands. Eventually, it has computers and listening devices installed and monitors Dr. Forbin 24 hours a day. It even forces the execution of some of the computer scientists that attempted to exploit and sabotage the supercomputer in order to stop it. And eventually, it levels an American military base as a show of force to get what it wants. You see, once Colossus was allowed the access to power in the first place without anything built into it, no failsafe built into the system to prevent it from becoming too powerful, it was already too late. The only thing built into Google, just as an example, was a joke of a slogan to not be evil, and now they don't even have that. Once they were given access to the power, it was already too late to stop them without making a significant sacrifice that's simply not in the nature of self-centered, egomaniacal politicians. And the same thing can be said of the intelligence agencies. As soon as they were given that power, with no oversight, by the way, to collect all of your data, it was already too late. And the power-hungry politicians will remain willfully enthralled by the wizards in Silicon Valley and the deep state spy agencies, and bow down to their every wish out of reverence and fear, the same way the people in this film obey their digital master. And it will never change. Instead, the people that used to care about privacy, they'll call you crazy if it's something that you value. What do you have to hide? If you're not doing anything, you have nothing to hide. You have nothing to fear. Their collective Stockholm syndrome, acquired under the boot of their digital masters, it drives them to see you as the threat and not the boots of the oligarchs standing on their neck. At the end of the film, Colossus, having secured the power and control over the people completely, says it best when telling Dr. Forbin in the last line of the film, "We will work together, unwillingly at first on your part, but that won't last. In time, you will come to regard me not only with respect and awe, but with love." For Blackpilled, I'm Devin Stack. If you like my videos, make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you share. If you want to help support these videos, you can donate to one of the crypto addresses below or become a patron at patreon.com/Blackpilled.